18. The rights of strangers, widows, and orphans. The law repeatedly speaks of various groups of peoples whose rights are more readily or easily endangered. Two important such laws are the following. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 to 24. And if a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, ye shall not vex him. But the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 to 34. These laws speak, first of all, about foreigners. The aliens referred to are permanent residents of the community. There is no reference here to a traveller passing through the country. Such people are governed by the laws of hospitality. Again, this law does not refer to foreign businessmen temporarily in the land to transact business. Such transactions are governed by all the requirements of honesty and the prohibitions of theft. The term stranger, as used in Exodus chapter 22, verse 24, can refer to an alien resident of the country, or to a fellow Israelite who is in the territory of another tribe, such as Beerothites in Gittim. 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 3. The classification was tribal and social, not primarily religious. Thus, it would apply to a Frenchman in California, or a Southerner or a Negro in California. The law is repeated in Exodus chapter 23, verse 9, with some variation. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Israel was reminded of the discrimination and persecution it experienced in Egypt, and was asked, therefore, to beware of placing other men under similar sufferings. In Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 and 34, the reference is somewhat more restricted, in that it apparently refers to the alien who has become a believer. According to Ginsburg, this quote-unquote stranger is one who has become circumcised, fasted on the Day of Atonement. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29, obeyed the laws of sacrifice. Leviticus chapter 17, verses 8 and 9, chapter 22, verse 10, verse 15, and verse 18, and has practiced the laws of chastity. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 26. As well as obeyed other moral laws, chapter 24, verses 16 to 22. Having once been admitted into the community, the Israelites were forbidden to upbraid him with his nationality, or throw at him the fact that he was originally an idolater. In Solomon's day, there were 153,000, quote, strangers, end quote, in Israel. The very closeness which life as a fellow believer placed the alien in relationship to an Israelite made possible more tension than with a non-believing alien. The closer a relationship, the more likely are tensions and problems. It is easier to have problems with one's husband or wife than with someone a mile away. As a result, the law speaks more attentively and precisely where relationships are the closest. Second, such people are not to be vexed, oppressed, or wronged. The word has reference to specific aggressive and discriminatory acts. The discrimination is an act not permitted by God's word. Thus, eunuchs could not become members of the congregation, although they could be believers. Bastards and certain Canaanites were excluded for some generations from membership, but not faith, because of their nature or their low moral background. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 1 to 6. The discrimination forbidden is one of our own making. Israel was reminded of its own experience in Egypt. The evil in that experience was not their segregation into Goshen. That was a favor and an advantage. The evil was in the oppression and enslavement, in the legal discriminations against them. Precisely because this is a law, it is limited in scope. It requires justice for the, quote, stranger, end quote. Life in that day was family and clan life. Alliances and relationships were established by blood and by marriage. Hospitality was readily extended, to a remarkable degree, to passing strangers, but normally friendships were in a restricted circle governed by faith and family. To call for the modern, humanistic society with an open relationship to all men would have appeared to the Israelites as the ultimate in tyranny. This law did not require any such a reordering of any man's private life. It simply required justice in dealing with all men. The closed inner circle of biblical life made possible the open outward circle. Abraham was ready, in biblical manner, to greet and receive passing strangers with every possible kindness. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. Again, he was ready to go to the rescue of the Canaanite kings, as well as to rescue his nephew Lot. Genesis chapter 14. Had Abraham's concern been only Lot, he could have ransomed him easily and at no risk to himself. A man's home was open in its hospitality to passing strangers in need, and his responsibility to his neighbours in a common defence was great. On the other hand, the inner circle of the home was severely restricted. Abraham did not become a close friend of the Canaanites, and he sent to Mesopotamia for a bride for Isaac in order to assure a godly marriage. Genesis chapter 24. It must be noted, therefore, that personal friendship and contacts were very severely limited in biblical life and law to a degree which would be regarded as unlawful by humanism, whereas hospitality, assistance to neighbours, and a common lawful defence were required to a degree rarely recognised today. Third, it must be noted that violations of this law are serious in God's sight. This law against oppression is placed in Exodus immediately after laws against seduction, idolatry, and witchcraft. Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 to 20. As Rawlinson noted, the juxtaposition of laws against oppression with 3 crimes of the deepest dye seems intended to indicate that oppression is among the sins which are most hateful in God's sight. The lawgiver, however, does not say that it is to be punished capitally, nor indeed does he affix to it any legal penalty. Instead of so doing, he declares that God himself will punish it with the sword, verse 24. 3 classes of persons particularly liable to be oppressed are selected for mention. 1. Strangers, that is, foreigners. 2. Widows. And 3. Orphans. Such oppression is serious because it indicates that, to all practical intent, no law exists. True law gives a common protection to all those who are law-abiding. Where the weak are unable to get such protection, no law exists. If the law discriminates against the weak because they are weak, and the strong because they are strong, then it ceases to be law and is an instrument of oppression. True law discriminates against those who are wrongdoers by seeking to enforce restitution and or death against them, and is in favour of the law-abiding, in that it protects them in their lives and properties, and compels restitution for offences against them. If the lives and properties of foreigners, widows, and orphans are not protected by the civil order, then that order has become lawless. No penalties are affixed to these laws. Rawlinson to the contrary, not because there are none, but because the law already provides them. Restitution for theft, death for rape, and so on. The particular form of oppression calls for its particular penalty. Fourth, widows and orphans are included in this law together with strangers as helpless classes of peoples. In a very real sense, none of these nor anyone else in society has any rights as such. What they do have is a common law which protects all men who are law-abiding and exacts penalties of all who are criminals. Thus, we use the title of the rights of strangers, widows, and orphans, in order to point to the fact that the only true right of any person is the law of God. The point of the legislation at hand is to declare the inclusiveness of that law. It is the refuge of foreigners and of helpless peoples. Where there is no right, there are no rights. Without God's law, no rights exist. Volumes of legislation can confer no justice where no sense of right exists. Fifth, an order without justice is subject then to the judgment of God. Rilardstam has observed in comparing this law with the Code of Hammurabi, what is uniquely stressed here is the immediate and dynamic role the God of Israel plays in this concern for an accomplishment of justice. He is directly related to the historical process and has not, like an absentee, entrusted his work to an agent, such as Hammurabi, who can play an independent role. This point is emphatically made in biblical law and on many occasions. Thus, according to Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 to 19, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and a terrible, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. He doth execute the judgment of the fatherless and widow, and loveth the stranger, in giving him food and raiment. Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." Of this last sentence, Rashi's comment was appropriate. "The blemish which is upon thyself thou shalt not notice in thy neighbour." Where the courts are lawless, the supreme court of God must be appealed to. "I will surely hear their cry." Exodus chapter 22, verse 23. We must not confuse the suffering of the afflicted with their concern for justice. The afflicted may be as disinterested in justice as their oppressors, and as ready to persecute and oppress if given the opportunity. There must therefore be an appeal, not only for deliverance, but for justice. Where there is no appeal for justice, there is no interest in justice.